In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a simple yet beautiful microscopic scene in Cinema 4D. Let's do it. Hey everybody, it's Nick here again from Greyscalegorilla.com, giving you the tools, training, and tutorials to help make you a better motion designer. Now, we have a really fun tutorial coming up today, but before we do, I wanted to remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel where we have a ton of videos just like this covering multiple topics on Cinema 4D. And if you're ready to step up your Cinema 4D game this year, check out our Grayscale Gorilla training page where we have advanced training to help up your C4D game right now. All right, let's get into today's tutorial. Today is all about making a simple microscopic looking scene in Cinema 4D using some basic techniques. Now, we're gonna combine a bunch of simple techniques here, some depth of field, some luminant geometry, some atom arrays, some cloners, but we're gonna combine them in a way to make a really unique, fun look that you can actually apply to a lot of different styles inside of Cinema 4D. So with that, let's head on into Cinema 4D and let's get making this thing.
All right, here we are in Cinema 4D, and like most of our tutorials, we're going to start from scratch, so as many people as possible can kind of follow along, and so let's get right to it here. I'm going to use a torus. Now, we've used a lot of different primitives here, but for this tutorial, I'm going to use the torus. Feel free to follow along with these other ones. It'll work exactly the same. So here's the torus, and the first thing we need to do is use an atom array. So you can find that right up here in this menu. Click the atom array and put the torus inside of it. What atom array does is it looks at where the intersections are for each of the polygons of your object and make a little mesh. Now, the mesh is controlled by the object itself. So if you turn up the radius or down or the segments, you're going to add more or less mesh, just like this. So you can actually kind of move those around and decorate it however you want, make it look the way that you want. In this case, it just kind of left it standard. So let's go, move forward here. We got our atom array, and the atom array gives us some controls, and you obviously could do a lot. You could thicken up the pipes here. You could turn up the spheres. But if you make these both the same number, it'll actually just kind of give it a wireframe kind of look, and that's how we got this look along this. Okay, so from there, you may notice we don't actually see the back side of our object in those renders, and all I did there was I grabbed the original object and I copied it and I pasted it. So now I have the original with the atom array around it. And so that's just going to give us this kind of Spider-Man mesh kind of thing. So now if I create a new material and I drag that onto our atom array, I could come into that new material and I could turn off the color, turn off the reflectance, and literally all we want is some luminance. It's a really simple setup, but it's a very powerful look once we get it all set up here. So that's the basics of just that grid. Now we have to tackle the kind of particles and all that stuff around it. And then the last step is we'll add the depth of field and get rendering. So the next thing is all those little particles around it. So for that, I used a disk. Now this disk is way too large here. We could use really small little particles. And the reason I use a disk is because it's generally low polygon. It'll render kind of fast. It will duplicate fast. And so you could use pretty much any object or shape you want, but the disk allows us to use a ton of them without slowing down our final render. So we can come up to our cloner. So we could go to Mograph, go to cloner, put the disk inside of that. And now this cloner object is what we're going to use to clone these disks along the edge of our shape. We want it to kind of look like it's exploding out all these little pieces. So for that, I'm going to use our original shape here. That's this torus. And in the cloner, I'm going to go to object mode. That's going to allow me to drag in an object and just go to the torus and drag in that torus. And now, if we look really closely, all these disks are being cloned on each one of these corners here, right? And that's because it's set to vertex mode. And that's okay, but we actually want way more particles than just how many vertexes there are. So I'm going to go to surface. And what that's going to do is clone these this disk along the surface of this object. And this allows us to turn up the count way, way up and allows us to get thousands of little particles all along this thing. And anytime you have a lot of an object, you want to try to turn this on. Sometimes this will break things. You'll see me turn this on and off in other tutorials, but this render instances will speed up the viewport and a lot of rendering and all that stuff. You can see the viewport starting to slow down. If we turn on the render instances, it speeds the whole thing up, including our final render. Okay, so now that we have all these disks kind of cloned along the edge, how do we spread them out? Well, you want to randomize all these little particles. So if you turn on the cloner here, if you highlight the cloner, and you come up to your Mograph menu, you can go into the effector menu and pick one of these effectors, and it will automatically get added to this cloner. So let's go ahead and grab our random effector, and you can see those particles kind of get spread out. And that's automatically set by the position here. You can turn this up and down. You can kind of adjust it. And as always, if you're playing along with a tutorial, follow along, but also experiment. What if you put other objects in here, other colors, all those kind of things. Okay, so we obviously want position moved. What about scale? Well, if we turn on scale, turn on uniform scale, and this will allow us to kind of scale up and down these particles and kind of randomize them. See that? Now, I don't need a ton, but I do need a little bit here. Let's turn this up. And then let's actually shrink our disk back down a little bit, maybe 1. I want these to feel like really small little particles. And then if I go back to my cloner, I could turn this count up again. Just keep dragging it up, right? Because we're using render instances, we could really crank this up and see a big difference. Okay, so those are the kind of little particles. Now, there's one last piece of this render, and that's kind of larger particles along the scene to really add to the depth of field, because this depth of field effect that we're going to add is going to make things that are close to the camera and far away from the camera very blurry, and then it's going to make the one thing that we want sharp to look sharp. But the more things that we can get closer and further away from the camera, the more that it's going to interact with the background and give us this really rich look. So how do we add that? So I'm literally just going to duplicate our cloner because it has a lot of good stuff going on already. I'm going to copy and then paste. And now I have a second cloner that has the disk inside. And it's just a good place to start. In this case, I'm going to go to a grid array. And I'm going to add a few more pieces here, 10 by 10 by 10. Okay, so this is going to give us a bunch of little particles. And now what I could do is scale this up and fill up the scene. I kind of want to make almost like a star field. Look at all these little particles getting closer to the camera, further away. And this will really give us those little subtle depth of field cues. And in fact, I want to make this larger. I might make this, 3. Look at how big these pieces are. Now, when we hit render now, it's going to look a little silly. It's going to look a little plain. But watch what happens when we start to add the depth of field effect and a couple other simple textures here. It's really going to give it that effect. It's a really simple look, but let's do it. I mean, if it's simple, Nick, let's get right on it. No more messing around. I'm going to make a new material. I'm going to put it on the torus here, and all I'm going to do now is just turn off the color. And in fact, we could just turn off the whole thing. We could leave it black. We could add a little reflection if we want, but this way, it's just really simple. It gives us this really simple geometry, and then you can see all these other objects are floating around. Well, I want to take our white material, first of all, and put it on our first cloner. Those are going to be these little pieces, these little explosions. And then I'm going to make one more material. In fact, I could just duplicate this white material, duplicate, make the second one a little bit dimmer. And this is because we don't want these big particles floating around to be as bright. And in fact, if you followed along with some of our other tutorials, I encourage you to try to make these all slightly different colors using the variation shader or something like that. And that'll just make it look a little bit more unique. But this is how I made my original, with just a really dim kind of gray color. And that's so it doesn't take away from this. So now let's hit render and realize, it doesn't look much better, does it? Well, we're missing that really key element. It's that depth of field effect that makes it look like this little microscopic thing. And remember, picking the right camera and picking the right lens and picking the right focus can really make a huge difference in any render that you do, not just this one. I want you to think about cameras in every render you do, and this one's especially included in that. So let's pick a camera, and in this case, we want it to feel microscopic and very small. So one thing we could do, the first thing we could do is pick a focal length that represents that. Now, zoom lenses have a very high focal length, something like 200-300. So we can actually just type that in, 250, let's say. Now, anytime you have a zoom in lens, man, you got to back up, right? You got to move far away if you got this big old lens, right? So now we have this lens, it's aiming at our object. And what's really nice is that lens is going to help us get that depth of field effect as well, because now we have a lot of distance between our object and us, and it's going to really make that depth of field. If you've ever seen a macro or photography where they have this really, like a photo of a ladybug or something, you're going to see a lot of depth of field effects. Okay, so enough talking, Nick. Let's show you how to set this up. Well, first of all, you're going to want to set up your depth of field. So in your physical render settings here, under the camera, you're going to see it's all grayed out. Now, why is it grayed out? Well, that's because we're not yet using the physical render. We're using the standard render. And I recommend the physical render for all your depth of field effects. In fact, I've been using physical for so long now, I just kind of default to it. But Cinema does not default to it, so make sure you go into your render settings, turn on physical. And so what else do we have to do? Well, let's go back to our camera. Let's go to our physical settings and see now it's not grayed out. We can go to our f-stop. And if you know about photography, you know that a lower number of f-stop is actually a wider lens. And what that means is it lets in more light, and that also means that the depth of field effect, that blurriness between what's in focus and the background and the foreground, is more pronounced. So the more blurry you want it, the more open you want the lens, which means the lower the number that we type in, okay? So let's go really low. Let's go 0.5, okay? So that is a lens that barely even exists in real life. I don't even think a 0.5 lens exists. Usually they're 1.2, 1.8, 2.8. So 0.5, let's hit render. What do we get? Well, we still get nothing. Why is that? Well, in the render settings, under physical, you're going to see this button right here, depth of field, bing, turn it on, come back, hit render, and now we're going to get some depth of field. Now, this is very blurry. Why is that? Well, our focus is off. Okay, we're using physical camera settings, we're using real depth of field effects here, and now we have to be concerned about something we are almost never concerned about in Cinema 4D, and that's focus. What are we focused on, and how do we drive focus? Well, the easiest way to do this is to go back to your object tab in your camera, go to your focus distance, and you can turn this number up and down, but the best way to do this is to click this little arrow right here, click, and then click on what you want to be in focus, click. And it's going to type a number in there automatically. Look at that, 6,887. So this little point right here will be in focus. Let's hit render again and see what happens. Okay, well now what it looks like is it's a little bit out of focus. It's a little blurry. What happened? Well, almost everything in this scene is fitting within the focus range, right? And also this 0.5 number is not blurry enough. Now, we could solve this, we could have solved this originally by making our object smaller. That would actually help, right? If we make the object smaller, the plane will be smaller, our focus plane will be smaller, but how do you fix it now that everything's all set up? Well, you just type lower numbers in. Let's do 0.1 instead of 0.5. Now let's do a render. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, now we have a lot more blurriness between the back and the front, and then we have this one sharp little line, but can we go lower than 0.1? We can. 0.05. How's that? That's double the amount, right? I rendered to the picture viewer there by accident, but that's okay. We got this going on. We got a ton of blurriness. We got our edges, and we're looking closer, but we're still missing one key part of this look, and that's the chromatic aberration. And chromatic aberration is the imperfections of lenses kind of make light bend in different ways, right? Or glass in general sometimes makes light bend in different ways. If you think of a prism, the colors that are coming through the glass are going to hit the chip or the film at different points and really give it this just black and white image. It's going to actually refract and bend light in a way that will mess up the colors. And we can actually emulate this directly in the physical render by going into our physical here and going to chromatic aberration and turning it up. Now, I want you guys to experiment with this stuff too. This lens distortion, vignetting, all this stuff is built in. It's really fun. You could also do this in post, but I do like playing with it in cinema as well. So I'm just going to turn it up to 100. Let's go. Let's see what this looks like. Now, that is the look that you may have seen in the original render, this kind of rainbow look. We got a little blue here, we got a little amber going on here, and these imperfections will start to add a little bit more life to the scene. You saw how simple the setup is, but these little imperfections are going to, make it a little bit more rich and kind of pop off the page, right? So let's set this up for a final render, talk about some render settings, fix a couple more things here, and we'll make this a real short one today so you could go off and start to experiment with this stuff, because you saw how simple it is, how we could pull a couple simple elements here in through Cinema and start learning about depth of field, some textures, some luminance, and we didn't even use lighting. We didn't do anything. It's all luminant textures and some depth of field. We get some really unique looks. So first of all, we need to make this square. Let's go to our output. I'm going to make this 1280 by 1280. That's just going to give us that square frame that the original was in. Now I'm going to reframe it. Remember, if we reframe it, that we have to refocus it, because now look, it's out of focus. And that's interesting looking actually, but we have to refocus it. So let's go to our camera. Let's go to our object and click, click, boom. There we go. Back to focus. Looking good. We could even tilt the camera a little bit, give it a little bit more unique perspective. Let's render this into the picture viewer and give us a little bit of a view. That's looking good. Okay, so let's address these other kind of blurry elements that are floating around here. I think we could add more of them, and maybe even larger, right? So let's go to this disk and let's turn it to 4 or 5. Let's go 5 maybe. And they're also all pointed in the same direction, right? We can actually go in here to our random effector and say, I want you to affect rotation as well, right? It's bugging me that they're all kind of facing the same way. So if we hit random, you're going to see it's going to affect the small ones, but also the large pieces. They're kind of flinging around there. Now we get little edges. And I also want more of these. So I could just come up here and say 16 by 16 by 16. That'll add a ton more. Let's even stretch them out a little bit further so we get a few closer to the camera. And remember, the ones closer to the camera, those are going to kind of blur the whole background and give it over some like color wash. Look at all the richness now that we have in the colors. We have some depth of field obviously going on, and some really, really cool effects here going on. Now the only thing we have to solve is this grain issue. You saw it rendered pretty quickly. We're just using the standard physical render default settings. And especially with depth of field, it's not going to let you get away with that, right? It's the settings are not good enough by the defaults to get rid of all this grain that we get. Depth of field is something that takes a long time to render. I want you to use it sparingly, but when you have all these little pieces and unique items in your scene, in camera 3D depth of field might be one of the only ways you could pull this off. You could pull it off in post, and we have tutorials about that as well, on how to add this effect in After Effects and stuff like that. But I want you to know how to use this so you could use it in some of your stills as well, because it does look really good. Okay, so quick setup here about the physical render. Here are the default settings, and we have adaptive low, and these presets aren't perfect, but they can start to get you toward the right path. So if you could just go to medium, and we do another render here, you're going to see already the grain is cleaning up. Good. That looks much better. For a final render, it's still not quite grain free. I think you could see it on your monitor, but compare between here and here. This one's a lot cleaner. And you could just start turning this stuff up. Now, we have other videos about physical render settings and all this stuff. And we also have presets that kind of ship along with a lot of our plugins like Top Coat, HDRI Studio, that kind of make this a little bit easier. But you could start with these. If you turn it to high, it tends not to be a very efficient render, but it can get the job done. So let's see what that looks like. Here goes the high render. And if you're wondering why I have extra buckets on physical render, it's because I'm using Team Render right now. I got a couple other machines in the office that are helping me render this so that we can see it faster and iterate faster. That's what it's all about, right? And this looks pretty good. I think actually this setting for this look might do the job. I like the way that these little pieces are out of focus. The chromatic aberration has got a good kind of feeling to it. And I would add a little bit of post to this, maybe just a little bit of contrast in Photoshop or something like that. But I think this is looking pretty dang good. And you can see how simple of a setup this is to get these looks. And we basically, I replicated this through most of the other primitive objects. So what I would recommend you do now, if you followed along this, for this long, first of all, thanks for watching. We always appreciate it. But also, you know, I want you to go experiment with taking these simple concepts about luminant geometry, which look, we have 3 textures, a black, white, and gray. We have a really simple camera setup. We have some depth of field and some cloners, and we got some really cool looks. So what I want you to do now is take some of the simple ingredients that you just learned and played around with in Cinema and go apply it to your own piece. Now, it could still be primitives, it could still be depth of field, it could still be all these things, but see what you can do with color and shape and different textures and different, objects, other parts of Cinema that you could bring into this knowledge and try to make your own piece. And when you do, I'd love to see it. Please put it in the comments, whether it's on YouTube or on our website at Greyscalegorilla.com. I'd love to see your work and what you've learned from this, and really just see what's possible with some really simple elements inside of Cinema 4D.
Hey, thanks again for watching, everybody. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And also, don't forget, if you want to really step up your Cinema 4D game this year, check out our training page where we have advanced training from some of the best Cinema 4D teachers out there today. All right, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in another tutorial really soon. Bye, everybody. Hey, when in doubt, use an atom array. I love that thing. I love that thing. Atom array, girl, atom array, yeah.